Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The transatlantic slave trade was arguably the greatest crime in human history. In it, the rich and powerful, having invaded and occupied the countries of Africa and carried off everything they could carry, turned their attention to every one they could carry.
Shackled into the holds of leaking verminous vessels, increasingly British ships, men, women and children stolen from Africa were sailed across the seas as slaves. Anyone who has visited the Slavery Museum in Liverpool will have come away from it in something like a state of a shock.
No reparation for this crime committed against a continent and against tens of millions of people has ever been made. In fact, it was the slave owners who were compensated when the trade was abolished. The descendants of the slaves are now plentiful, and among us in every former slaver country, some of them cry out for justice and organize to win it. One of those is Esther Stanford Kosi, spokesperson of the African Emancipation Day and the Reparations March Committee. Esther, welcome back on the Sputnik.
Thank you.
The march is on Tuesday, 9 a.m. from Windrush Square in Brixton. I can't be there this year, but of course my heart will be. But let's start with this depressing fact. Every time we raise this on television or when I raise it on my radio show, there is a storm of hatred, aggression, and denial, actually, from white people, of course, but in surprisingly large numbers. Now, if that shocks me, it probably doesn't shock you.
No, it doesn't, and this is part of the problem. There is what we call maangamizi denial. And maangamizi is a Kiswahili term that we use to describe the transatlantic trafficking or enslavement of African people, but a continuum from chattel enslavement through colonialism to modern-day neo-colonialism. So we do not use the term transatlantic slave trade because that term implies that this was just a commercial venture gone wrong and actually minimizes the massive genocide that happened to African people and still continues to happen.
Well, we'll come on to that. I don't want to minimize that in any way, and I take your point entirely. But if one did look at the transatlantic slave trade, it is actually a mark of such shame that you, or ought to be, that you would think no one would come out of their rabbit hole to effectively deny it or deny any need for reparations for it.
That's right, and that just shows how we are still not afforded in the eyes and I think the hearts and minds of many white people and other non-African peoples our full humanity. There still isn't recognition that we are human beings who are entitled to justice, who are entitled to redress, who are entitled to recognition of our cause. And that is what we're really seeking to change with this reparations movement. We are seeking to counter what we call the maangamizi denial, in the same way that Holocaust, Jewish Holocaust denial, is a crime in many countries. But yet maangamizi denial happens every day, and it happens even by some of those who are deemed to be the most enlightened in society. So this shows the kind of real insidious nature of the Afrophobic, what we call white supremacist racism that we still continue to face, even at the hands of liberals and so-called white leftists who should know better.
Never was the word even more odious. Never was the word even more inappropriate. But that's another argument. What are the demands then of the committee and the march?
Okay, so the march partners with the Stop the Maangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. And what this campaign is seeking to do is to call for the establishment of the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice. This is a commission that is connected to an attempt to bring together many victims of crimes against humanity at the hands of European settler colonialism, genocides and various forms of dispossession into a true alternative, a true court, a world court that we call the People's International Tribunal for Global Justice. So the two go together. And what we are calling for is actually let us have a dialogue with British state and civil society as to the Maangamizi, what it is, what its causes have been, and what its contemporary consequences are for African heritage communities, not only within the UK, but wherever we actually reside and we live, especially in the continent of Africa, in the Americas, Oceania, everywhere basically where African people are. So those are the main demands. It is about recognizing the current day manifestations of the Maangamizi, and what we do on the march is we hand in the Stop the Maangamizi petition to 10 Downing Street, and this petition actually details 12 manifestations of the Maangamizi that are displayed on this bright postcard here, and it includes things like deaths in police, prison and psychiatric custody, state menticide in terms of what's happening to our children, racist immigration patrols and policies, the dismemberment of African communities, an end to austerity measures that have been imposed upon our countries. I mean, there are so many. We're also, raising within the context of the Maangamizi Afrophobic racism, all this privatization of our resources, land grabs and extractive industries that are denying us actually the wealth and resources of Africa. So recent reports conducted by Mark Curtis of War on Want and also the Jubilee Debt Campaign and many other organisations. There are in fact two reports. One talks about Britain's new colonialism, and in terms of Britain's controlling, in fact not Britain, but 101 stock companies registered on the London Stock Exchange, controlling over $1 trillion worth of resources in Africa, including in terms of 5 main resources: gold, oil, platinum, diamonds, and so forth. And then the second report, Honest Accounts, really speaks about the fact that Africa and African countries are a net creditor to the rest of the world at the tune of a minimum, these are very conservative estimates, $41 billion a year, and this is according to statistics for 2015. So this notion that somehow Africans have been scroungers and we're getting all this aid is actually a myth, and this is research that has been conducted by European people, researchers, scholars who have detailed how that extraction, how that Maangamizi continues to happen, and therefore what we're seeing is an increase in migration to Europe, people literally dying crossing the Mediterranean Sea because the conditions within which they live in their home countries, in their motherland of Africa, it's become so ungovernable and so difficult for people to live, because basically all of our resources literally are being extracted, not for the benefit of African people, but for the benefit of these rich multinational corporations. And let's just be very honest here, the standards of living that many people in Europe want to protect comes at a price. And this is part of the price that many African people and other indigenous people are having to pay.
Now, your case is that slavery may have stopped, but colonialism then took its place, and in the overtly colonial period, Africa continued to be looted of its wealth, and then when so-called independence occurred, that colonialism didn't stop, and it takes the form now of British and other Western capitalist countries still using their financial and economic power to extract wealth from Africa. And now we have a return to actual physical colonialism with US armed forces forming this AFRICOM.
That's right.
And effectively beginning a new European...
Yes, a new scramble, a new frontier.
A new scramble for Africa, yes.
But it's not just the United States government. We also have to look at the complicity of European governments, and in particular the British state, which is why when we march on the 1st of August, we are charging the British state with acts of genocide and ecocide against African people, both on the continent of Africa, but also everywhere where African people live today, including in Europe and specifically the UK.
Oh, I mentioned the Slavery Museum in Liverpool. When we visited, you leave the museum speechless. Really, you don't know what to say, what to do. Is that how do you regard such an effort? Is that a step towards that recognition?
It is an aspect of educating people about the history of African people prior to enslavement, but also the resistance that African people have engaged in to emancipate ourselves. And that's something very key, because I think in the psyche of many white people, we're still seen as these begging, pleading, helpless Africans. Yeah. And actually, what the reparations movement is about is seeking to assert our dignity, our self-determination, and to restore our sovereignty, because basically we know what works best for us. Only we can repair ourselves, but we need to have the shackles removed. And literally, these shackles are not only economic, they're cultural, they're political, they're religious, in many ways. So reparations is very holistic. And the end goal is actually about the restoration of a sovereign Pan-African nation state that can incorporate not only African people on the continent, but Africans who have been dispersed in the diaspora. Because right now, there isn't a recognition that we have a right to belong to Africa, that we are African people, and therefore we have a right to also benefit from her resources as much as we must share in actually helping Africa to overcome the challenges that she faces. And that is why the repair is essentially about us regaining our power, regaining our ability to fix ourselves, but also we must have the redistribution of wealth and resources. We must have everything that we need in order to restore ourselves and to make ourselves whole again. The essential aspect of reparatory justice must result in the transformation of the group that are seeking to repair themselves. And what's consistently happening is that the dialogue doesn't even allow us to define for ourselves, in the mass media in particular, what we mean by reparations. So there's always this jump to, how much money do you want? We've already paid you enough. We don't start with money, because just throwing us some money in a neoliberal economic system that continues to take it out of our hands is not what we want. We're not so stupid. Actually, what it's going to entail is moving with many of the other global justice movements that are seeking transformation of the international economic order. And so what we expect, especially for those who see themselves as allies, is to amplify the voices of the movement of resistance.
Well, we've amplified your voice today, and a very powerful one it is too. It's going to be a long march, but it starts with the first step, and this year's first step is 9 a.m. on Tuesday in Windrush Square in Brixton. Esther, thanks very much for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you. Coming up, what on earth is happening in Venezuela? Find out next.